Best friend's dad took photos of us to exploit our trust, and after that day, I lost my childhood friend forever. When I was in 3rd grade, I made a friend named Nicholas. Nikki, for short. We were both on the quieter side compared to our classmates, and we both shared a love for pudding cups. One day at school, Nikki forgot his lunch at home, so I told him he could have my pudding cup. That's how we became friends. From that moment on, we shared my pudding cups every day. The other kids in our class used to tease us, accusing us of having crushes on each other and chant that horrible to an 8-year-old, at least, KISSING song all the time. It had become customary for Nikki and I to separate ourselves from the other kids at recess and at lunch. We had a big tree we would always meet under, in the morning, at recess and for a few minutes after school before our parents came to pick us up. Nikki himself lived with his older sister and single mother. He tried explaining the concept of divorce to me once, but in my 8-year-old mind it didn't make sense that his parents weren't together, happily married. As you can imagine, my parents were married, and my home life was the epitome of adoring, nuclear family. Imagine Full House, except with a mother who hadn't passed away, and a couple of cousins instead of uncles. I can't recall a single moment in my childhood where I left unloved or uncared for in any way. I soon realized that was a rarity. During one of mine and Nikki's morning visits to the tree, as we had cleverly nicknamed it, he invited me to his birthday party. He excitedly unzipped his backpack and withdrew an invitation card made of blue construction paper. There was a hand-drawn tree on the front, 2 little kids of approximately mine and Nikki's size and coloring, and a home address, scribbled inside. To this day I still have it. When the bell rang, he and I ran inside with the rest of the kids and I waited all day for him to give out the rest of his birthday invitations, but he never did. I was the only one he had invited. Because the other kids teased us so much, my 8-year-old mind had chalked it up to the conclusion that he didn't want any bullies there and had therefore invited his only friend. Me. Suffice to say I was flattered and happy. I gave the card to my mother later on in the evening. She smiled and said, "How cute," and very quickly gave me permission to go. It was my first non-family birthday party. The next day I went to the store with my mother and older brother and we picked out a birthday present for Nikki. He and I were heavily into Transformers, so we got him a tiny Transformer, after getting permission from his mother, and I wrapped it up in blue wrapping paper all by myself. His birthday was on the following Saturday. My mother dropped me off at Nikki's house, briefly speaking with his mother in the kitchen, discussing pickup times and how fast they're growing, before kissing me on the forehead goodbye. Because Nikki, his sister, and I were the only ones there, we decided to play a couple of board games and then tag when it wasn't raining anymore. We were in the backyard. It got to be a little sunny after, and Nikki and I fell deep into our dramatic reenactment of the latest and most exciting Power Rangers episode to date. That we had seen, at least. His sister, a preteen at the time, went inside for a minute to check something which Nikki later revealed to me, was a code phrase she used when she wanted to talk to the cute neighbor boy on the phone. Inside the kitchen, his mother was cooking and keeping an eye on us through the window. It was only as we went inside to eat, that I realized there were no decorations. In fact, there wasn't anything to signify that it was Nikki's birthday at all, except for the homemade chocolate cake. I had loosely gathered that Nikki's family didn't have a lot of money, and that maybe that was the reason he went to school without lunch so often, but I never really asked and Nikki never really said anything. Not that an 8-year-old would do either of those things. We went down to the basement after we cute the cake and took a couple photos, where there was a tiny TV and an SNES. We played video games for roughly 10 minutes before there was a loud knock on the door. Nikki stopped the game, Yoshi's Island, and jogged up the basement stairs to answer the door, eventually screaming, "Dad! I thought you said you couldn't come." He was very excited. Understandably so, considering how rarely he saw his father and what a big occasion it was in his life when he did. He would always tell me about it at school. That his cool, fun dad came to visit and took him for a ride around the block on his motorcycle. For a while, I'll admit I wasn't sure if I believed his dad actually owned a motorcycle, but when Nikki came down to introduce me to his dad, I followed them outside into the front yard and saw a big, black Harley parked in the driveway. There were 2 helmets. One for his dad and one for him. I was instantly jealous. My own father drove a minivan, and wore polo shirts and cargo pants almost religiously. Nikki's dad, however, was the complete and total opposite of mine. He wasn't suburban at all. In fact, he looked like a character out of The Outsiders. Right away, I thought he was cool, and right away, I wanted to fit in with them. I should note that Nikki and I came from different ethnic backgrounds. He was white, I was not. Because I went to school with majority white kids and lived in a town with majority white population, I found it very difficult to fit in sometimes. That was part of the reason I had grown too close to Nikki so quickly. He was pretty much the only kid in school who gave me the time of day and I, him. The other kids didn't like me because I looked different and they didn't like Nikki because he wore old, faded clothes. He was raised on a modest salary. His mother had a few jobs if I remember correctly. She was a waitress, a grocery store clerk, and a part-time janitor. For a single mother with 2 growing kids, a house, and a car that was always breaking down, she was really quite optimistic. I liked her a lot. She was always nice. Even when she caught one of the bullies in school shoving Nikki to the ground once, she was nice. So when she wasn't nice to Nikki's father, and when she pulled him aside to ask him to leave the party, I couldn't help but wonder why. My mother picked me up soon after, and I made a pact with Nikki that I would come over again very soon. Because my mother had finally met his in person and spoke with her, I was allowed to come over and play now. Before that she would always tell me, not until I meet his mother. From that point on, I went over to Nikki's house 2 or 3 times every week. Sometimes his mother would be there, sometimes his older sister would be there. One of them was always there to look after us and make sure we didn't get up to any trouble. We would usually just go down to his basement and play video games, or, when the weather would allow it, we would ride bikes in the cul-de-sac and jump on his tiny trampoline. He was always better at flips than me, and I kind of resented him for it. One time he tried to teach me how to front flip and I nearly landed on my head. The second I got to my feet I ran away and started crying, mostly due to embarrassment. I wanted Nikki to think I could hang, but I couldn't really do any of the cool things he could. My own parents thought trampolines were too dangerous and forbade me from jumping on Nikki's. I used to do it, anyway, though. Kids will be kids. Nikki thought I was cool, though, and to get my crybaby ass to feel better, he admitted he was a little jealous of me. He said he was jealous of my new clothes, my new bike, and just everything new that I had. That was the first time he opened up to me about being less privileged. The SNES in his basement was an old gift from a cousin of his who lived in the next town over, but it barely worked half the time. That was probably why his cousin gave it away. We sat in his basement for a few minutes talking about all the little reasons we were jealous of each other, and then his sister came down to say she was going to the mall with her friends, but that their dad was coming over to look after us. Their mother was at work that afternoon. For whatever reason, Nikki was shocked to hear his dad was coming over. I took it as a surprise visit and ran outside with Nikki when we heard the motorcycle. Indeed, his dad was there, and he also had a late birthday present for Nikki in his hands. It was a box, roughly the size of his head, and it was wrapped in newspaper. When we went inside to open it, he made Nikki promise not to tell his mother what he got him. Apparently his mother didn't want Nikki to get a present from his dad, but his dad bought him a present anyway. Nikki readily nodded, so I followed his lead. I watched Nikki tear the newspaper to shreds, revealing a brand new Polaroid camera. Nikki had no idea what it was at first, looking to his dad for answers before I excitedly said, "A camera? You got a camera?" I could tell Nikki felt embarrassed, that he didn't know right away, but he was also just so happy that he got something. He brushed the embarrassed aside and we opened the box to play with it. His dad taught us how to use it, and explained how it worked to us. He pointed it at Nikki and snapped the first photo, flapping it in the air after, and then showing us the final product. It was very cool to me that the photos came out right away. My family had a camera, too, but we had to wait for the photos to get developed at a store. By that time I'd always forget and lose interest. But Nikki's new Polaroid camera printed out photos right away. Nikki loved it, and I loved it, and his dad really seemed to love it, too. When his dad pointed the camera at me next, I smiled like a dork and we all laughed at the photo after. My front teeth were missing and I looked like I was high pretty much. Nikki and I traded our photos after. He kept the photo of me and I kept the photo of him. We said we'd be friends for as long as we kept the photos of each other intact, so I took extra good care of mine. Now that we had a new toy to play with, I was always asking to go over to Nikki's. Because I lived in a house with so many other family members and relatives, I felt lost there sometimes. When I went to Nikki's, I felt more like I belonged and it was always quieter there, too. It was the mid-90s at this time, so parents were less strict with their young children, and mine allowed me to spend hours at Nikki's as long as his mother was okay with it. She always was. She loved having me around because she knew how happy it made Nikki to have a friend to hang out with. My mother would frequently send me to Nikki's house with some sort of dish or snack, and she even invited Nikki's family to my house for dinner once. My family really liked his family, and I think my older brother had a tiny crush on his older sister, but she was all about neighbor boy, so tough luck, bro. For this reason, I was allowed to go to Nikki's house almost every day now. He didn't live too far from my house, either. We were within walking distance of each other, maybe 5 blocks away. His house was one of the few places I knew how to get to, apart from my own. There were times when I would go straight to his house with him from school, and times when he would come over to play with me at mine. The latter happened rarely as we both preferred his house. Mine was just way too crowded. One day at school, Nikki told me his dad had come over the other night, and got mad at him for not taking any new photos with the Polaroid he got for his birthday. Both Nikki and I loved the Polaroid and we thought it was very cool the first few times we played around with it, but, as most kids do, we eventually lost interest in it, and Nikki sort of just tucked it under a blanket in the basement and forgot about it. I guess his dad didn't like that very much, so Nikki asked me if I'd help him take photos for the next time his dad comes to visit. In fact, his said he dad specifically requested that I be in the photos. I found this perfectly normal as an 8-year-old. I figured Nikki's dad wanted us to have fun with the camera and immortalize our friendship, make a scrapbook or something. Up until this point, Nikki's mother and sister still had no idea he even had a camera. I agreed I would come over soon and we would take a bunch of silly photos. But Nikki forgot to mention one thing to me. He forgot to mention that his dad would be there. It was the same story as last time. His mother was working, his sister was at the mall with friends, presumably with money their dad gave her, and their mother had no idea any of this was going on. I went over there after school, and I noticed the motorcycle parked out front. Nikki didn't seem surprised to see it, but something about his mood was off that day. I figured it was because he got in trouble the last time he saw his dad. Because it was raining a little, we went inside to hang out in the basement, where I thought we would play on the SNES for a bit, but that wasn't the plan at all. Nikki's dad was in the basement. He greeted me with a big smile and asked us how school was, if we did anything fun at recess, what kind of things we learned in class, the usual. I thought nothing of it, as my parents would always ask me similar questions. Eventually Nikki's dad said we should start taking photos, so I obliged. I smiled widely for the camera, but instead of pressing the button and laughing at the photo like we had done the other day, Nikki's dad tutted at me and said I should try to look prettier. I had no idea what he meant by prettier, so I just smiled a little smaller and held it for a second before he corrected me again. As you can imagine, he kept at it, nitpicking at me until I let my hair down, telling me to pinch my cheeks before every photo to make sure they were flushed, rosy and pretty. This whole time he hadn't taken a single photo of Nikki. Because it's been decades, and because I've somehow managed to block most of this out, I'm not entirely sure what led up to it, but Nikki's dad eventually convinced me to start taking articles of clothing off. First my jacket, then my socks, and then my cardigan, and then, he asked Nikki to get in the frame. This whole time Nikki had been standing off to the side, not saying a word, and not looking at me either. It was like he felt something was wrong, but he was too afraid to say it. What ended up happening is exactly what you think. First, Nikki was told to hold my hands, then hug me, then put his face really close to mine, and then he was told to kiss me on the mouth. His dad snapped photos of it every step of the way, asking Nikki questions like, "Isn't she pretty? Don't you think she's pretty, Nick? Do you want to take her on dates?" It was a whole lot of that and a whole lot of touching. The whole time I stood completely still, not really sure of what was going on. Had any other boy been there with me, I'm not sure I would have remained so calm. Because it was Nikki, I felt somewhat safe. I didn't feel like we were doing anything wrong. The kiss was gross to me, but everything else I was mostly okay with. We stopped pretty quickly after that, the kiss, not because his dad wanted to, but because I had to go home. My mother came to pick me up. Usually my brother would, so he could talk to Nikki's sister a little bit, but he had basketball practice that day, so my mother came instead. For some reason Nikki's dad didn't go up to answer the door. He asked Nikki to do it, and I took a second to grab my jacket and sweater and put them on. During this time, while Nikki's dad and I were alone in the basement, he said he would come back to take more photos one day, and that I should wear makeup next time. I didn't have any at 8 years old, but I didn't him that. I just collected my things and got out of there to go home. I saw my mother at the door and she hugged me, asking how my day was, and suddenly, everything was normal again. For me, anyway. I glanced back to wave bye to Nikki, but he had already closed the door. The next day at school, he completely ignored me. I went to the tree and waited there all morning and all recess, and for an extra 15 minutes after school, but he wasn't there. I saw him in class, so I knew he was at school. He just didn't want to hang out with me for some reason. This carried on for the rest of the week, until one day, my mother got a phone call from Nikki's mother. I was in the living room watching wrestling with my brother, and I vividly remember my mother's smile vanishing as she listened on the phone to whatever Nikki's mother was saying. I remember asking what was wrong, if Nikki was sick, but my mother didn't say anything to me. She just nodded and listened, face draining of color as though she had seen a ghost. Later, she asked to speak with me in my bedroom, and asked me very clearly, "Sweetie, who was there at Nikki's house the other day? Was it his sister Angela or someone else?" As soon as I said, "someone else," her eyes became watery and she asked what happened. I was vague on details because I wasn't really sure what had happened myself. It was such a blur to me at the time. The only thing I was worried about was Nikki, and why he had been ignoring me. Because I didn't want him to be more mad at me and ignore me for longer, I kept quiet about the camera, just saying that Nikki's dad watched us play and told me I was pretty. The last part was apparently enough to set off a huge red flag in my mother's mind. She gave me another hug, told me she wasn't mad at me and that everything would be okay really soon. So this is what happened. Apparently Nikki's mother had found the camera, asked Angela about it, and then Nikki, quickly learning that their dad had been coming over without her knowledge. The rule was he could only visit when she was home, but the past few times, she wasn't. The next day, I found Nikki under the tree at school, and he very seriously told me we couldn't be friends anymore. I asked why, and he said just because. He went so far as to giving me back the Polaroid of me smiling like a dork, the one I had exchanged for the Polaroid of him, both of them signifying our friendship. Because nothing had really happened, because the world was a different place 20 years ago, and because the photos weren't explicit in nature, nothing happened to Nikki's dad. But that's not for lack of trying on our mother's parts. I remember going to the police station, telling them everything with my mother there beside me, and repeating the story again to various lawyers, but the most we were able to accomplish was preventing Nikki's dad from seeing Nikki and Angela. Apparently, by coming to the house when Nikki's mother wasn't there, he had violated the terms of their custody agreement. When it was all over, the meetings and everything else, Nikki and his family ended up moving. Apparently Nikki knew this was going to happen, and that's why he told me we couldn't be friends anymore. I want to say I managed to give him the photo back before he left and that we shared a pudding cup one last time, but I can't, because those things never happened. He moved and I stayed, and for a really long time I sat alone at the tree during recess. Eventually I made new friends, eventually I stopped waiting for him to move back, and eventually I was a happy kid again, but I have never, not once in my life, forgotten about Nikki or what happened in his basement that day. The way everything about him changed so drastically. If it weren't for his dad, I'd like to think we would have remained friends, at least through childhood. The silver lining is social media exists, and when I was 17, I found a friend request from a boy named Nikki in my notifications. Nikki's dad, let's not meet. Ever again. Update 1. This one isn't as sad, I promise you. The beginning takes place in my senior year of high school. My life had changed a lot. The town where I lived was no longer so densely homogeneous. There were people of all different ethnic and social backgrounds. Particularly in the high school I went to. It was a co-ed private school. I had to wear a uniform and everything, because my brother had gone to the same school previously, and because he had been incredibly popular amongst his peers. I was given a bit of a head start on the social ladder, so to speak. In other words, I wasn't a loner anymore. I had friends and I was deeply involved in extracurricular. To the point that boys actually liked me, which was so foreign a concept I almost couldn't wrap my head around it. My parents were rather strict with me, though, and didn't let me leave the house until I had done my homework, finished my share of the household chores, etc. In the 9 years that had gone by since the first part of this story, my cousins and older brother had moved out of the house. Most were in university or living alone, working at this point. I was the youngest and the only one left. The house was empty now. Just my parents and I. As a kid, I had always dreamt of living in a quieter, less crowded atmosphere, but I quite missed all the ruckus. It was fun, in hindsight. In any case, because I was rarely given permission to go out, particularly at night when there were parties and things, I decided I should bring the party to me. There was this boy in my high school, Dean, who for some reason liked me a lot. He'd flirt with me in the hallways, in class, and wherever else. There were times when I would find him by my locker with a funny story to tell, his backpack slung on one shoulder and music from his earbuds filling the negative space between us as we spoke, eventually walking home together. For lack of better words, he was hot. On the rare occasion that I was allowed to go out, I would always drag a friend or two with Dean and I on our dates. He would bring his friends, too, and we would eventually ditch them so we could run off somewhere and make out. For whatever reason, though, we were never official. He had never really asked, and to be honest, I wasn't interested in having a boyfriend anyway. I was so focused on school and extracurricular, I had no time for a relationship, and neither did he. We were comfortable just having fun together. Either way, he eventually expressed interest in taking our fun to the next level. By that I of course mean sex. He wanted to have sex with me. Being 17, I had never gone that far before. I wasn't really sure if I wanted to the first time he mentioned it, but the more I thought about it, and the more we made out, I thought why not? We both lived our parents, so choosing a time and a place was rather difficult. Being the absolute gentleman that he was, he suggested his car, but I kindly declined and instead told him he should come to my house with me after school. My parents were both workaholics, so I was home alone a lot. There was no way anyone would catch us. As long as Dean parked his car a couple blocks down and quietly followed me inside, everything would be fine. One day, that's exactly what happened. He snuck into my house after school. I brought him up to my room and we started kissing on my bed, rather hard might I add. Before I knew it, he was on top of me, tugging at my clothes, and I was under him, blushing fiercely. I didn't want him to see me naked in broad daylight, so I asked if he would close the curtains and blinds, and he promptly did. When he was back on top of me, I shrugged out of my shirt and I let him see parts of me uncovered for the first time. It was going smoothly in my mind. There was nothing that could go wrong. He was being gentle, patient, and I was very much into it, until he said it. He pulled back a few inches and whispered, "You're so pretty, insert name." As with the other times anyone had ever called me pretty since 3rd grade, be it a classmate, a relative, or a lady at a clothing store, I froze. I hated being called pretty. It wasn't that common of an occurrence, mind you, but when it did happen, my entire body would turn rigid and I would hear that word in a man's voice. A grown man with a Polaroid camera in his hands and a look in his eyes that I can only describe as hungry, calculated. Being that we had only just gotten to know each other, Dean had no idea why I didn't like the word pretty. He figured I was just a little insecure and had to be reminded of how cute he thought I was. I obviously didn't want to tell him the real reason out of fear that it would scare him away. He was a nice person, but he was also just a normal, teenaged boy who, to my knowledge, lived happily inside his white picket fence bubble. I envied him because of it. Still, he felt me turn rigid, and he apologized. We took a moment to collect our breath, and then I don't know, I pushed those memories to the back of my mind, and I followed through with what I had set out to do that afternoon. I lost my virginity to Dean. And that was that. I half expected him to ignore me at school the next day, but he didn't. He put his arm around me, loosely so I didn't feel trapped, and guided me to his and his friend's lunch table. Everything was cool. I was beginning to like him more and more, and we eventually made it official. I decided it was time I introduce him to my family, so I brought him home and explained to my parents that Dean and I were dating. They were slightly taken aback, but they welcomed him all the same. My parents were Away's massive hockey fans, so they were pleasantly surprised when I told them Dean was on our school's hockey team. He was very good, and I had gone to a few of his games here and there to watch him play. Eventually, I went over to Dean's house to meet his family. It was my first time and I was very nervous. I knew they were good people for having raised such a nice boy, but I couldn't help but worry a little. What if they didn't like me? What if they thought I wasn't good enough? The usual blend of thoughts in a meet the parents type of situation, I would think. In any case, they took to me fairly quickly. He had a mother, a father, an older sister, and a younger brother, and they were very nice people. For whatever reason, though, Dean's younger brother went to a different school than us. He was a freshman at one of the public schools in the next city over. Apparently his grades weren't up to par, but I call bullshit. The school system screwed him over. He was a smart kid, very smart. In fact, he's currently enrolled in McGill, which is basically Canadian Ivy League. Anyway, I eventually added Dean's brother and sister on Facebook, because that was the norm at the time. People kind of just added anyone, no matter how distant of a connection. It was a fairly new thing back then, too. 2007. As far as I know, only university students had it before that, so to us it was very cool, and the people with the highest friend count were obviously the coolest lol. I want to say maybe like 2 or 3 weeks later, I came home from school and did the usual. I hopped on MSN and chatted with friends while listening to music and studying. I had a midterm, I think. One that I was totally and utterly unprepared for. Because of that, I slowly focused all my energy on studying, quietly ignoring the messages my friends were sending in our group chat. Oddly enough, I still remember the song I was listening to when it happened. I took a break from the books, absent-mindedly clicking at random on my computer, when I saw a notification in the window where I had Facebook open and running. I clicked on it, expecting an app notification to one of those annoying games everyone used to play, but I soon came to realize my suspicions were wrong. It wasn't an app notification. It was a friend request from a boy named Nikki.